It had been raining for days. The torrential downpour could have easily been attributed to the power of a wrathful god hungry for vengeance. It started out as a light drizzle that came out of nowhere one day. The people of Konoha were pleasantly surprised by the little shower in the height of summer. It was a welcome relief from the scorching heat of an up till then dry year. But the rain didn't stop, and on the second day of the downpour it turned from a light drizzle into what the elders of the village claimed hadn't been seen in decades. The streets were mud by the end of the third day. Some depressions in the streets became nothing more than lakes. After 4 days, flooding was a real threat, and all shinobi out on missions were recalled to help deal with the minor crisis. The first floors of homes and business were boarded up and sealed by the on-hand genin and chunin. Jonin were tasked with diverting water elsewhere and out of the village. On the 5th day, the Hokage announced that this was the greatest storm in 50 years. Thunder and lightning lit the sky constantly, seeming to be never-ending. The rain had become a real threat to the village, washing the streets away entirely as the hard-packed upper layer of the roads were turned to mud and erased. The lowest areas in the village were flooded, and only the efforts of Konoha's water users kept places like the Hyuga clan compound from becoming a lake. Day 6, and it was the longest and hardest storm in living memory. The village was flooded up to 4 feet in most places. Travel for shinobi was possible, but civilians were restricted to moving with the aid of the ninja. Still, the storm worsened. With no end in sight and the waters threatening to undermine the foundations, the Hokage ordered a full rotation of all the ninja in the village. They were to take shifts reclaiming the village from the storm that had taken hold of the streets. Meanwhile, the Great Barrier around the village was activated for the first time since the last Great War. The rain stopped for the most part. It still required a week to regain the streets, but it was only the beginning. After a further 2 days, the chakra generators keeping the village's defensive barrier up failed. The third Hokage was forced to reapply them, but making the powerful seals by himself was time-consuming. In the 3 days it required to remake the seals, the village had flooded again. Outside the village, the forests were unrecognizable. Civilians and ninja alike no longer doubted that this was the work of the gods. Who else could cause the skies to weep for so long? The village seemed to be in agreement. This storm was a message from Kami-sama. But there was one person in the village that didn't care about the rain. Sitting in his apartment, Naruto Uzumaki was unconcerned with the downpour outside. The blonde 14-year-old was lying back on his bed, an annoyed expression fixed firmly upon his face. Where the rain caused him no discomfort, the piles upon piles of books in his usually Spartan apartment did. Blue eyes stared out over his bed at his room. His territory had been invaded when the storm had stated to flood areas of the village. Unfortunately, the library was at street level and could not be properly sealed in time. Therefore, the council, or whoever was in charge of the library, had decided to relocate all the books to Naruto's apartment complex. This was mainly because the building had 3 floors and the top 2 were mostly unused. He didn't know that, of course. What he did know was that all the other rooms in the apartment building were jam-packed full of books, and his room had not been spared either. Fully half of his room was filled with tomes on everything from history to science to jutsu theory and more. He hated books. They were plain useless things. From his experience, admittedly limited to the books at Academy, they were boring. Admittedly, the ones on jutsu were helpful to a ninja like him, but they were still dry and not in the least bit interesting. And he'd been stuck in his apartment with them for the last few days. His now very cramped apartment he would be quick to add if asked. With all of them in stacks to the ceiling, the only free room to move was between his bed, the bathroom, and the door out into the rain. He'd already moved all his ramen into the bathtub since the refrigerator was effectively blocked off. All in all, it sucked. What made it worse? He had nothing to do. He was a genin with no water jutsu and no skill in fuinjutsu. Which meant that he was of absolutely no use to the squads outside dealing with the storm. That annoyed him even more than he was willing to admit. All he really wanted to do was get out and train. With Sasuke gone from the village, he felt like he was wasting his time in a very serious way. Or, fuck that. Who was he kidding? What was he going to do if he went out and managed to train some? He didn't have anyone to teach him. Kakashi had proven that one well enough already. A whole month and he barely even did anything for him. It was always about the stupid Uchiha. Naruto grimaced and rubbed absently at his chest where, Not 3 weeks before, there had been a smoking hole. Try, fucking Uchiha. Stupid Uchiha wasn't quite harsh enough to express his feelings for that prick. It didn't matter how much he cared for Sakura or Sasuke. The retard had put a Chidori through his chest, fully intending on killing him. He could go rot in hell for all he cared. Of course he still intended on bringing Sasuke back, but Sakura never said she wanted her crush back in one piece. He dragged Sasuke back to the village alright, with 2 broken legs, 2 broken arms, and if he could manage it, a dozen broken ribs. Maybe if he was lucky one rib would pierce his cold uncaring heart. As if. Naruto huffed again as his thoughts continued to churn. After the incident with Sasuke leaving the village he'd come back mortally wounded. Although that didn't keep him down for long. He recovered in record time and returned to the daily routine. That is he did until the rain started. And now he was stuck in his apartment, fully cognizant of his own uselessness. He despised the feeling, wanted it to end. Naruto's eyes flicked from one end of the apartment to the other and back again. His eyes narrowed. Well, if he didn't have anything else to do, then he would swallow his distaste and do a little light reading to pass the time. He wasn't usually welcome in the library, so this was an opportunity that he shouldn't miss. And, if he was honest with himself, his academic scores in school sucked the big one. Maybe he could actually learn something if he spent some time reading. With a loud, fuck it, Naruto made the ram hand seal and 6 clones burst into existence. Having given them no orders, the clones just looked at him puzzled. Oi, boss? What you want? Guys, can't believe I'm saying this, but if I don't do something I'm seriously going to die of boredom. We are going to read until the storm blows over. The clones nodded, still looking at him as if waiting for more. And, since I never do anything 50%, we're going to read all the books in this room before the storm stops. The 6 clones shared genuine looks of surprise and distaste. They didn't like the idea of reading any more than he did. But, they were him after all. What could he expect? Okay boss, if you say so. Good, then start by putting all the books you can in the storage scrolls one got. Once you free up some room I'll make more clones to speed this up. He stood up on the bed, smirking. Since I figured out you guys give me memories when you die. I've been thinking about all kinds of things to do with it. But since I can't train I'll use you to learn all I can. The clone nodded again in unison. If you say so boss. Naruto jerked his head to the numerous books stacked nearly to the ceiling. Well, get to it. One each of you reads a book. I'll disperse you and take a while to absorb all the info and make another clone to replace you. A second later the clones were in action. Naruto thought for a moment then said. If you find a book I personally might like, toss it to me. They didn't respond, but they didn't need to. Naruto leaned back against the wall with arms crossed. In the last month, or more precisely, in the week after he failed to bring Sasuke back, he'd learned a lot. First and foremost he learned that the Kyuubi was a bitch. Okay, maybe not literally a female dog, but he really was an asshole. After nearly dying the Kyuubi had taken him inside his mind to give him a very rare lecture. It had completely blindsided him. The Kyuubi gave him the dressing down of his life, basically telling him that if he ever wanted to be Hokage he better start to use his fucking head for something other than a battering ram. The fox was pissed at him for nearly dying and took the time to tell him just how close he'd come to croaking. Apparently his body had just finished adjusting to the fox's chakra 2 days before the fight with Gaara in possession mode. This meant that he had come within a hair's breadth of dying. If he'd fought Sasuke any sooner, the Kyuubi wouldn't have been able to force enough chakra into his body to heal him. So yeah, a seriously close call. So close in fact that it scared the shit out of him and, in a roundabout sort of way, made him wise up. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. He also discovered the secret of shadow clones. Or well, discovered was a bad way to putting it. Hitting his head repeatedly against a wall at his own stupidity and lack of perception was what really happened. It was blatantly obvious the entire time, and he never noticed. Oh, and he was going to kill Kakashi for not taking the 5 seconds needed to tell him, lazy ass had it coming. But that would have to wait until the rain let up. Until then he would have all the time in the world to read. With that grim proposition running in his mind Naruto dropped onto his rear end bed as his clones started sorting the books into more manageable piles. It took about 30 minutes, but together they completed the task. When it was done all the books in the room were organized by subject and interest. Subject was a broad definition. The clones only made stacks according to what looked like academics, jutsu, fiction, history, and miscellaneous. Interest only referred to books that the clones thought would actually be interesting. A moment later there were a couple books lying on the bed, the most interesting ones of the bunch. Naruto idly noted how much extra room had been made and frowned. Then a light bulb went off above his head. "Oi, you guys pick out the books you're going to read and then stick yourselves to the ceiling to read. That will double the amount of clones that will fit in this space." The clones shrugged and each grabbed a book before jumping upwards to land on the ceiling feet first. They stuck there using their chakra, then sat cross-legged to read. Naruto made the proper hand seal again. 9 clones appeared this time. 2 grabbed books and went to the ceiling while the rest sat on the floor. A moment later they were all reading, with varying degrees of interest. Naruto sighed and grabbed the first book on the corner of his bed. He opened it and read the dedication. "This book is dedicated to all my fellow shinobi who are having trouble with the Farer. At the request of my teammate, my sensei, my male comrades, and several people all over the village. Here is the Shinobi's Guide to Women and Other Dangerous Creatures. I hope that it will provide my readers with a good base when dealing with the most deadly beings in our world. Be aware, what you will read here would get me hanged in the street by a mob of angry women, so do be discreet. Orochimaru of Konohagakure." Naruto lowered the book in shock, his eyes widening in realization. So, the bastard actually had some good in him after all. He shook his head hard and turned his attention back to the book. He turned the page, reading it carefully. While he hated Orochimaru for several dozen reasons, if the snake had written a book like this, then he has atoned for at least one of his many crimes. Naruto was willing to forgive Orochimaru summoning a snake to eat him at least. Depending on just how useful this book really was, the evil son of a bitch might actually get formal thanks the next time they met. Naruto turned the page again, slowly becoming absorbed into the book. Orochimaru used a lot of what he would call big words, and his writing style was difficult to sift through, but what he wrote was amazing. The guy, twisted as he was, seemed to know what he was talking about. By God, the snake was onto something. 6 hours later Naruto dropped the book on the bedside and dropped back onto the bed. His mind was swimming with memories of every interaction he'd ever had with a girl. From bumping into the crazy snake lady, to getting on the wrong side of Sakura. "I was blind but now I see." Naruto sat up and shouted to his clones. "Hey, if you find anything written by any of the 3 Sannin, prioritize it. I think I need to get that asshole's autograph before I try to kill him next time." He was a genius. He got no response from at least half of his clones, but the rest looked up and nodded. Naruto grinned and grabbed the next book from the small stack. It was smaller than Orochimaru's book, practically a journal. He read the title, "The Compendium of Summoning, A Beginner's Guide to the Summoning Animals of the Elemental Nations," by Tsukumo Hitaki. Naruto hummed to himself as he started in on the book. Maybe he could learn more about the toad summons from this? If he could, it would be a big help. A long while later there were several loud pops and an agonized scream. A little while after that Naruto came back from the realm of unconsciousness after about 30 books were forcefully shoved into his head in an instant. He sat up shakily and rubbed at his eyes, cursing himself for not thinking about the consequences of dispersing all his clones at the same time. It hurt like hell and made his head spin unpleasantly. It required a long few minutes before he regained any composure. By that time he was aware of what his clones had picked out to read. The results were in. A full 32 books had been read cover to cover in 8 hours. All in all he was pleased, except for the brief migraine. 3 books on history, 2 on geography, 1 about the clans of Konoha, 5 on important individuals in the village's past. Then his clones had devoured no less than 12 books detailing jutsu and jutsu theory. Followed by this were 3 books on math, 1 on applied chemistry, 2 on medicine. And all that was topped off with the entirety of Lord Jiraiya of the Sannin's works. They were, The Tale of the Utterly Gutsy Shinobi, Icha Icha Paradise, and Icha Icha Violence. And those last 2 were mainly responsible for the migraine. Naruto groaned as he realized he was blushing furiously and rubbed his hand over his cheeks. Damn that stupid perv. He'd never get those out of his head now. His shadow clones would make sure of that. That was one of the main strengths behind the technique. anything they learned was memorized permanently with perfect recall. I feel like I just lost my innocence. He sat for a moment, just looking at the stacks of books with a blank stare. No, I'm fairly sure I did just lose it. He would never be able to unremember 2 entire smut novels, especially after binge reading a book all about how women think and act. In other words, he just fucked himself over without even realizing it. At least he wasn't in the dark about why Kakashi was always giggling during training. He was reading that stuff constantly. Not to mention the books on math and human anatomy were still throwing random facts into his train of thought every few seconds. Naruto hissed in pain as lances made of pure applied chemistry embedded themselves in his brain. He lay back on the bed, cringing as the overload of information continued to integrate itself into his long-term memory. An hour or so later he was at last able to stand up and get some much-needed food into his belly. He sat on his bed then with half a dozen cups of instant ramen as a new batch of clones started reading again. He decided to leave off doing any reading himself from that point on. He would have more than enough disjointed information to sort through already. He hated math, he hated chemistry, and now he thoroughly despised geography. Naruto made sure his clones knew from then on to discard any books pertaining to that subject. Kakashi Hitaki, Jonin-sensei of Konoha, smiled as he felt the rain dissipate, going from light sprinkles to nothing more than mist, and finally nothing at all. The great storm was over at last. 3 entire weeks of torrential downpour, give or take a few days. It was the longest and most severe storm on record in Konoha, and even before that. He was simply glad it was over. For the first time in over 2 weeks he could see the blue sky and clouds that were no longer black and foreboding. In fact, besides the waterlogged village, it would have been a beautiful scene. A rainbow of epic proportions hung over the south side of the village wall, giving the sky a surreal beauty. Kakashi turned to the rest of his cleanup squad. Alright everyone, you have an hour off while the water settles in the low spots and exits the village. When that's done we meet up by the Akamichi barbecue to start dealing with the standing water. The 3 men nodded and jumped off to get some much-needed lunch. Kakashi just stood there on the roof, watching the rushing river where the street had been a few weeks before. It was almost disturbing how much water could fall in a week. And for it to continue for so long was unnatural to say the least. But hopefully it was over. Kakashi sighed and reached into his pouch for his Icha book, only to find his precious book was ruined by water. His visible eye widened in horror as he looked to the back of the volume to see the waterproofing seal had failed. Tears welled up in his eyes. This book had been given to him by Jiraiya himself. It was a first edition copy, signed by the perverted Sannin himself. It was beyond price, and now ruined simply because of water. Kakashi stared up at the heavens, cursing them for destroying something so precious to him. Didn't the gods now? Icha was how he coped with all the mistakes he'd made. This book had been his friend and companion for years. The dog-eared pages and worn cover were symbols of his love for it. It declared to all who saw it just how much he enjoyed reading it, even the dialogue and action scenes. But, he could not cry. He was a jonin and that was not acceptable. The only thing for it was to get another book, and take care of it far better than this one. He would make his next collection of Icha damn near indestructible. With that purpose firmly in mind, Kakashi jumped off in the direction of Naruto's apartment. He knew that the civilian council had decided to use his apartment complex as the storage place for the local library's books. And the boy could use shadow clones better than anyone he'd ever met. He could find him the first 2 books in the series in no time. Kakashi arrived at Naruto's apartment 5 minutes later. He walked up to the door, already preparing suitable excuses to help the boy find what he wanted. After all, Naruto knew what Icha was, even if he had yet to experience the true joys of it. He personally didn't need Naruto getting on his case about reading erotic literature. The other jonin had that right. His cute little students didn't. Kakashi fixed his best eye smile on as he raised his hand to knock on the door. He knocked again, and again. The jonin frowned and prepared to pound the door hard when it suddenly opened. Standing in the doorway, looking up at him, was Naruto. Or at least one of his clones. Kakashi looked into the room, somewhat shocked by what he saw. There were at least 30 clones in the room, half of which were adhering to the walls and ceiling. The rest sat on the floor or leaned against large stacks of books. All of them were reading. Kakashi's gaze settled on Naruto's bed where the blonde was reclining back against the wall. In one hand was a book. In the other were a pair of chopsticks. And in his lap was a cup of instant ramen. As Kakashi watched, the blonde used one finger to flip the page while taking another careful bite of ramen, as not to spill the precious substance. Meanwhile, his eyes were keenly focused on the book in hand. Kakashi scanned the title from the doorway, his eyes widening even further. A treatise on survival, fangirls, fanboys, and other vicious beasts. Minato Namikaze. Kakashi watched as one of the clones suddenly popped. Naruto flinched like a kunai had embedded itself by his ear, and he closed his eyes for a moment. Then he shook his head and turned the page again. Hell? Earth to Sensei? He snapped out of his daze and looked down at Naruto's clone. Oh, sorry about that. I just knew that the library had put its books in this apartment complex and there was one in particular I needed. By the way, if you haven't noticed, the rain stopped. The clone nodded. We knew, but we're kind of busy. We already read all the books in this room and we finished half the books in the apartment over. Boss just found one written by the 4th Hokage too. He tilted his head. Anyway, what did you need? I could probably get you whichever book you need as long as it isn't one on geography or physics. We've been discarding most of those out of hand. Kakashi blinked. You sound a bit different. Something happened while you were stuck in here? Besides reading more books than most people read in a lifetime? Well, we read a dictionary yesterday and found out that our vocabulary was lacking. So boss prioritized literature so he doesn't sound like a moron all the time. And plus it makes reading all the other technical works much easier. The clone smiled. Anyway, what book did you need? Let me guess. Icha Icha Paradise or Icha Icha Violence? Kakashi started to sweat. You read them? Yeah, it was boss's fault though. He didn't realize that they would be in the stacks here, so he didn't advise us not to read them. I see. The Jonin glanced around the room. So you have already read all of these books? The clone shook his head. No, these are from the other room. All the books we read we put in storage scrolls and then moved them to where these books originally were in the room over. He squinted at Kakashi with a suspicious look. So, what book were you looking for? Sigh, you got me. Get me the Icha Icha books. Knew it, perv. Hey, you've read them too now. And with shadow clones you can probably recite the entire thing word for word. I should tell Jiraiya you memorized his books. He'd be so proud. Sensei. If you breathe a word of that to pervy sage, boss will steal Kurenai sensei's panties and hide them in your house, and then frame you for it. Kakashi cringed within the confines of his own mind, but crossed his arms as if unimpressed. Okay Naruto, if you want to play hardball, so can I. You should know that just because I wasn't a prankster, doesn't mean I can't do it like the best. Oh, you think you can even hold a candle to boss Kakashi-sensei? Maybe he should tell Bushier Brows-sensei that you wear a green jumpsuit behind closed doors and shout about youth when no one is around to hear you. The clone grinned wickedly. Do you really want to make war on the boss? I'm sure he's more than up to the challenge after being stuck in here for 3 weeks with nothing to do but think up new pranks and read. Deciding a tactical retreat would be best, Kakashi smiled again and put his hand to the back of his head nervously. Now, let's not get too ahead of ourselves here. I'm sure we can come to some arrangement. Like I thought. The clone smirked and popped. A second later Naruto, the original that is, looked up. Kakashi waved to him and put his hands together in a slightly pleading gesture. The blonde boy in the orange jumpsuit shrugged and made 2 clones. The first one darted out of the room past Kakashi, while the other one grabbed a book from the pile, scanned the cover, and sat down in an empty spot to read. Kakashi entered the room carefully, keeping his head low to avoid the clones stuck to the ceiling. So Naruto, how are things going? I see you took an interest to reading while you had the opportunity. Naruto glanced away from his book. I guess. Some books are better than others. I never knew so many people from Konoha wrote books. It's like everyone has a book lying around somewhere. I found books written by all 3 of the Sannin, 3 written by Gigi, and this one, written by the 4th. It's pretty awesome. Hey, sensei, did you know that the Uzumaki are a real clan? He froze. Naruto was peering up at him with a blatantly curious expression, but he was a master of looking underneath the underneath. And there was a certain subtle, something in Naruto's eyes. As if he was testing him. Actually I did. Then, why didn't you tell me I was from a real clan? Kakashi chuckled, his uneasiness never entering his voice. Well, you see I never really thought about it. I never really thought of you as an Uzumaki. A flicker of disappointment entered Naruto's eyes and Kakashi had to force himself not to wince. He knew that look. It wasn't betrayal exactly, but the look of someone who knew he was just lied to. The blonde's gaze dropped. Oh well, I guess that's fine. Shit. Kakashi glanced around the room, wondering what he could do to quickly make it up to Naruto. That was when he noticed the clone in the corner of the room reading a book on elemental manipulation. Hey Naruto, what do you know about using the elements? He blinked, confused. I know that elemental manipulation is the cornerstone of ninjutsu. There are 5 elements, each one being weaker to another and stronger to a second. There's fire, water, earth, wind, and lighting. Fire beats wind, wind beats lightning, lightning beats earth, earth beats water, water beats fire. Naruto frowned for a moment. You use lightning and fire jutsu for the most part sensei, but because of the Sharingan you can copy jutsu of any elemental affinity you can use. Which means you can also use the other 3 elements like you used water in the Land of Waves. Naruto seemed puzzled. Why do you ask? Kakashi stood there dumbstruck for a few moments before he at last got a hold of himself. The change in Naruto's attitude and knowledge was astounding. After just a few weeks he'd memorized concepts that would normally have been inimical to him. The Naruto he remembered would have probably had a hard time even remembering which elements were good against which. Now he could recite them all in order. Truly this storm seemed to have had at least one benefit. Ahem Naruto, I would be willing to help you find and train your elemental affinity. It's something I happen to have a lot of experience with. Before the Chunin exams I helped Sasuke find his. I'd like to do the same for you. Naruto frowned and then reached under his bed for a moment, fumbling for something. Then he leaned back, bringing a book with him. Kakashi immediately recognized it. The book was titled The Fall. It was a history of Uzushiogakure written by the last known Uzumaki, Kushina. Naruto's mother. What? How is that even here? Did the restricted portion of the library somehow find itself into his apartment as well? This here, Naruto said, weighing the book with one hand, is an account of how Uzushiogakure was destroyed by the alliance of Kumo, Iwa, and Kiri about 50 years ago. But it talks about the clan itself a lot. It says that Uzumaki are born with 1 or 2 of 3 elements, water, wind, or lightning. Although it says that Uzumaki are usually born with 2 elemental affinities. 1 from the father and 1 from the mother. It's actually rare for an Uzumaki to be born with just 1 affinity. Naruto's eyebrows drew together, and the clan is supposed to have a lot of powers that are borderline Kekkei Genkei. I knew that, but what does that have to do with anything? One of my clones read a book about elemental manipulation for beginners. And it showed how people discovered their affinities back in the old days before chakra paper was available. Naruto pointed to himself. It showed a way to channel me chakra into the air around me. Supposedly if you do it right then your chakra manifests in intricate patterns. I referred back to the book constantly for 3 hours until I was sure. I know I have wind affinity, and I'm pretty sure I have a lightning affinity. Kakashi found himself amazed again. Just how much has he learned all this time? Has he been reading and learning from an entire library worth of information on every conceivable subject for the last 3 weeks? If he has then, it might take months to sort through everything he'd learned. He mentally cried for the good old days when Naruto was easy to manipulate. Now he'd actually have to give the blonde 100% or be left behind. That is, if Naruto was anything like his father. So sensei, I'm pretty sure I know my affinities, but I suppose it would be more precise to get it tested the usual way. Do you have the time to help me? Of course. Kakashi smiled behind his mask. Not really. The village is going to be in a state of disrepair for weeks until dirt and gravel can be shipped in to fill the riverbeds that were once streets. All of the barricades and such need to be removed and flooded street-level buildings need cleaned. But I suppose I can use my legendary reputation to give Naruto a hand for a while. Yep. Those black cats are everywhere, constantly making me take the long way around. Cool, so, I'm just going to leave my clones here. I'll come with though. A second later Kakashi found 2 books deposited in his hands by the clone from before. He saw Naruto hand the book written by the fourth to the clone as he put on his forehead protector. "Come on sensei. Let's go." Kakashi slipped the 2 small books into his side pouch. "Okay Naruto, don't get ahead of yourself. We'll need to stop by Hokage's tower for the chakra paper. Most of the equipment from the ninja stores ended up being stored there. And we can pop in to see the Hokage while we're at it. I'm sure you'll want to know about your affinities. I guess." Naruto shrugged and they both left. A few minutes later they were entering Hokage's tower through a window. The grounds outside were still filled knee-deep with water. Afterwards they headed down the hall and into the second-floor lobby. Naruto glanced around at the piles and piles of stuff crowding every corner of the building. It seemed as though the tower was almost as crowded as his own room. Which was certainly saying something. Kakashi led him to the 3rd floor and over to the Hokage's office past a few chunin who seemed to be looking over a map of the village. Naruto scowled inwardly as the secretary looked up from her small desk. She in turn scowled back, muttering something under her breath about good-for-nothing jonin and the creatures they taught. Kakashi tensed at that last part, his fists clenching even as they stopped in front of her. "I'm here to get Naruto's affinity tested. I'd like to know where the chakra paper from the ninja supply store is kept." She glanced between them, almost seeming to think about refusing. But in the end she decided to tell them. "Down the stairs in room 2 to 14. Only take what you need Hitaki." "Will do." Kakashi grumbled and turned away, walking back down the stairs to the 2nd floor and taking a left. Naruto followed after him. His mind was lost, darting constantly between what was happening in that moment and what he'd learned in the past 2 days. Since he started reading and having his clones study en masse for him, he'd improved himself more than he'd ever imagined. His vocabulary was no longer limited to what a 10-year-old might know. He no longer went looking for conflict, as he demonstrated when he tried to get a feel for Kakashi earlier. Even the fox had commented on the rapid change, saying that, "Well, brat, you have a functioning brain after all, amazing. And you acquired that man's penchant for study. It seems you aren't a useless meatbag as I originally believed." It wasn't exactly the best compliment he'd ever received, but it wasn't the worst either. And the very fact that the Kyuubi chose to comment at all proved how far he had come in such a short time. Naruto personally thought that he had always had the potential to do this, to change from an immature kid into an intelligent young ninja. It just wasn't going to happen without that little extra push. The storm was that push. Without it the books would have never been stored in his apartment building. And without that he would have never become interested in reading or researching the myriad subjects available to him. Hell, he managed to improve himself immensely just having one of his clones read a dictionary. It tripled his vocabulary in 6 hours. Then Orochimaru's book. Now that was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As twisted as the man himself was, he had a far better understanding of women in general than anyone he knew. Certainly Pervy Sage had no clue. While he himself didn't understand why women acted the way they did, the book gave him guidelines to figure out the cause and effect. He even read an entire book on Fuinjutsu, which also happened to be written by Minato Namikaze. There was a book he might just have to reread, clones or not. All of it was a eureka kind of moment for him. It was all here, he just had to read it and sort through what he learned. Not all of it would be correct and some of it would certainly be opposite to the truth, but it was a start. He couldn't honestly say he wasn't still ignorant, but he could easily claim that he was working his way out. Naruto frowned, thinking back to the book, The Fall. It made his blood boil just thinking about it, but he'd read a book about controlling one's emotions and never letting others know what you felt inside. While he didn't like the premise of the book, which was to deceive others, he felt that the skill itself would be invaluable. Besides, he put on a fake smile all the time, and no one seemed to notice. Why couldn't he be calm and collected on the outside and furious on the inside? It would be excellent practice and allow him to get what he wanted easier. After all, how many people would tell anything to a pissed-off 14-year-old? If he wanted to discover the information he felt he needed to know, he would have to be calm, and he would have to be collected. He forced the frown from his face, replacing it with a neutral expression. It was hard, and it didn't feel right, but he needed to stop wearing his emotions out on his sleeve all the time. Otherwise people would find it too easy to take advantage of him. People like the third Hokage and Kakashi. Yes, he knew about them and their secrets all right. Once he read the entirety of the fall, he learned about Kushina Uzumaki. She was the last official Uzumaki alive only 20 years ago. She was the sister to the Uzumaki clan heir and therefore, the princess of Uzushiogakure. When she was little she was sent away to Konoha to be the container for the Kyuubi, and shortly after that the entire village of Uzu was destroyed. Her last name was Uzumaki. His last name was Uzumaki. It was easy to put two and two together. Even for the less than observant idiot he'd been a weeks ago, it would have been a piece of cake. Kushina Uzumaki was his mother. He had no doubt about it, and it would account for so many things in his life that had gone unexplained. For instance, why he was made the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi. If what he read was true, there was only one clan capable of having such a beast sealed inside them. His mother was the last Uzumaki, and now he was the last. He literally was the only one who could be used. It certainly helped put things in perspective. His parents hadn't hated him. They'd had no other choice. It was either him or the whole village. And it was clear from how Kushina wrote that she cared deeply for Konoha. She couldn't let thousands die just because she wanted her own son to live a happy and fulfilling life. And he respected her for that decision. He really did. He just wished she could have survived. But that wasn't all of it. Not by a long shot. His clone had been surprised, after starting to read Pervy Sage's first book. It wasn't smut at all. And in fact the name of the first character was Naruto, apparently named because of an incident in Jiraiya's life that got him his first kiss. Naruto, that was his name, and a fairly uncommon one. For instance, he knew two people named Sakura. And there were lots of people named Kiba in the village, although most were civilians. It was a popular name after all. But he'd only ever known of one Naruto and that was him. It was also known to him that Jiraiya the Sannin trained the fourth Hokage. And it seemed like a big coincidence that his name would be Naruto, the same as the main character in Pervy Sage's first and only non-smut novel. His Jiji, the third Hokage, had told him that his parents were heroes who died during the Kyuubi attack. His mother certainly had died, probably when the Kyuubi was being released from her. He didn't know much about the Biju, but he knew now that having one extracted from you was almost guaranteed to be lethal. But his question now was, who was his father? The possible answer to that had come like a bolt of lightning to the face. One of his clones, who just happened to be reading a book about politics and the structure of the first hidden villages, popped. And one of the first facts that jumped into his head was this. Jinchuriki, as the most destructive weapons a village can possess, are inherently a risk to the village itself. In order to retain control of the Biju they held, Jinchuriki were often made of the Kage's direct family, or adopted into the family at an early age. The answer seemed so clear. Minato Namikaze died the same day he sealed the Kyuubi inside him, at the cost of his own life. He was of course the fourth Hokage and most likely related to Kushina Uzumaki in some way. But he had no other family. As it was well known, the Namikaze clan was all but extinct. So, if the Hokage was close to Kushina Uzumaki, his mother, how were they connected? Well, Mito Uzumaki was the first container of the Kyuubi, and she was married to Hashirama Senju, the first Hokage. Was it so far a leap to think that Minato Namikaze might have married Kushina Uzumaki? It would explain why he himself looked nothing like an Uzumaki, and yet had the name. From the fall he knew that Uzumaki had pale skin and red hair of varying shades. But he was tanned with bright spiky blonde hair. Just like the fourth Hokage. When he'd first come to this conclusion he'd laughed himself silly, thinking how stupid and desperate he was. And how comical it was that he managed to convince himself he was the son of the fourth Hokage. But, then he'd gone back to the book written by Minato Namikaze and compared the picture to his own face in his bathroom mirror. Then it was obvious. He looked like a carbon copy of the guy, except his face was a bit rounder. Their eyes, hair, and skin were all the same. So, what did that mean for him? If he was the son of the fourth Hokage and the last Uzumaki, who just so happened to be the previous container for the Kyuubi. Well, for starters it meant he was royalty above and beyond even Sasuke. Not that it mattered to him if he was or not, but the fact that he was equivalent to a prince and yet lived in a tiny rundown apartment annoyed him. That wasn't even counting the fact that the villagers still overcharged him in civilian stores. Shinobi of the Konoha trusted him now, especially after saving the village from the Shukaku. If he was the son of the last Uzumaki and the last Namikaze, it meant that he probably certainly had a massive inheritance. And even a fraction of it could probably have him living in a decent apartment in a better district of the village, probably with anything else he wanted. He was sure of it. As the heir to two of the greatest clans in history and the fourth Hokage's son, there would have to be something wrong for him not to have a huge inheritance. So, why did he live in a rundown apartment in the first place? The answer to that was simple. He didn't know about any of this before. Naruto's mind came to a screeching halt as he realized something. All the checks that Gigi had sent him over the years. That was probably all his money anyway. He was probably living off a very small fraction of his inheritance this very moment. As Naruto walked behind his sensei through Hokage's tower, he felt the vein on his forehead begin to throb slowly. The nerve of him. That old bastard had him thinking for the last 8 years that all the checks he sent were out of his own pocket. As if that penny-pinching jerk probably had full control over his inheritance. It wasn't out of generosity. He was probably giving him the money that would be coming to him anyway. Naruto fumed silently. Going through his mind was the whole section on Jinchuriki in that book on politics. That's right, the old man wanted him loyal to the village. And what better way to encourage loyalty from a helpless orphan than to give him the money he depended on to survive? What was he supposed to say to that? If he ever found a reason to want to leave the village, the old man could use it against him. He'd say, Naruto-kun, after all I've done to help and support you, even going against the council to send you money, you're going to leave the village? His teeth ground together at the thought. The fucking old man had some explaining to do. And if he didn't like the answers he got, he was going straight to Shikamaru. The lazy Nara was just like his description, lazy to a fault. But when it came to his friends, Shikamaru pulled out all the stops. Shikamaru would come up with a way to get the information to the right people, and he could devise a plan to get his inheritance. Hell, maybe, since he knew Shikamaru's dad had nothing against him, just like Choji and Ino's parents, maybe he could get the elder Nara to help as well. But first, Kakashi-sensei. The silver-haired Jonin didn't stop walking but asked, "What is it, Naruto?" Naruto looked right at the back of Kakashi's head and went for the kill. "Why didn't you tell me you knew my parents?" Kakashi stopped dead, his body suddenly rigid. A few seconds ticked by and he suddenly swiveled on his heel, one eye looking down at Naruto in shock. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter how I know, sensei, but if you must know, it was because I'm smart enough to connect the dots when they're thrown in my face. If I decide I don't hate you when you're done answering me, then I might tell you exactly how I found out." "Naruto, I'm sorry." Looking up at Kakashi with a deadpan expression, Naruto muttered, "Nice start, kiss ass." Kakashi blinked and unfroze. His shoulder dropped and he sighed. "Listen to you. For a second there I thought I was speaking to your father, and then suddenly your mother pops in." He pulled a hand through his hair, muttering to himself about something under his breath. "Let me put it this way, Naruto. The fourth put down a few things in his last will. And let's say that some people might have ignored or deliberately misinterpreted them. The reason I haven't told you is because I was afraid to." "Why?" "Because I might not have been able to stay as your sensei." Kakashi said honestly. "I tried to adopt you, Naruto, over 50 times. And there are others too. Sume Inuzuka, she's still trying, but Lord Third won't allow it. Lord Third told me that I couldn't adopt you, but that if I was so keen on being there that I could be your sensei, under the condition that I focused on Sasuke, who would be training under me because we both have the Sharingan." Naruto's expression fell. He couldn't sense any outright lies from Kakashi. Which meant, so Gigi really has been responsible for all of this. He's the reason why I didn't even know who my parents were a week ago. "Naruto, it's not as simple as that." "Then how is it? Explain that to me, Kakashi." Kakashi silenced him with a look, his expression grave. "Listen to me and keep your voice down." The Jonin grabbed his hand and whisked him down the hall to the room they'd been looking for. The Jonin quickly opened the door and pushed him into the room, following a second later. "Tell me now?" Naruto hissed. "You're dangerous, Naruto." Kakashi spoke bluntly despite the look of anger on his student's face. "You are a Jinchuriki who could possibly release the Kyuubi at any time. Your seal is based off your emotional stability. The stronger your will is, the stronger the seal will be. But if something ever happened and you lost your will to live, or you felt you were betrayed by someone, the Kyuubi could get free. And there is no one in this village capable of stopping it if that happens. The older man knelt down by Naruto. Listen, Minato was my sensei. He, along with one of my teammates, made me who I am today. But regardless of how I feel about you, Naruto, you are still you. You are going to be the Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi for the rest of your life. And the Hokage had to make sure that you, who could be the most powerful shinobi in the world someday, would remain on our side. Naruto eyed Kakashi, his anger unyielding. Then why keep me in the dark? Why would you not tell me who my parents were? Why after all that's happened? Because Naruto, things got out of control. Lord Third was planning on making you a Chunin after the exams and telling you then, but he saw you use the Kyuubi's chakra. It scared him more than he's willing to admit. He thought that if you released the demon's chakra in a simple tournament match, that the seal must be coming undone. He probably assumed that telling you about your parents was too much of a risk. A risk? Naruto's growled. A risk because I might lose control and release the Kyuubi in anger? Kakashi nodded sadly. Yes, and you wanted to tell me? Very much so. He smiled as best he could with only one eye showing. After all, you're almost like a nephew to me. If your parents had lived, I'd probably be your lazy Uncle Hitaki that Kushina would beat for reading Icha Icha around you. So, Naruto looked down at his feet and thought, now that I know, can I confront Gigi about it? I mean, if I know the secret, what is the point? Could I move out of that dingy little apartment and into a halfway decent home? Just little things like that. I'm not expecting him to go and announce my heritage to the whole village. Nor would he. Your parents both had enemies. Despite how it looks, the village has only just recovered to the strength we were before the Kyuubi attack. Kumo is regrettably the strongest village, and they'd probably go after you if they found out the fourth had a son. They tried to kidnap your mother when she was about your age, you know. Naruto grimaced. I know, all right. Then you understand that revealing your heritage isn't advisable for quite some time. I personally wouldn't do it until you were a Jonin, or later. You have to remember that he still despises your father and by extension you. Well, I never said I would do that. His scowl deepened. I wasn't asking about telling the village. I specifically asked about telling Gigi. Kakashi sighed. I don't see a problem with it. Just don't harass him to release you inheritance. The fact is that both your parents were rich, but getting the money would require you taking up the mantle of the Uzumaki clan in the very least. Right now you are only, officially, an Uzumaki by name. Those clan funds won't be available until your status as a clan member is released. And why is that a problem? Naruto crossed his arms. Everyone already knows me as Naruto, Uzumaki. What is the issue with coming out and calling myself the exact same thing? And besides that, if I'm the only freaking Uzumaki in Konoha and my mom had enemies or something, what's the point then? I'm still tagged as an Uzumaki either way. The Jonin blinked and groaned as he realized the truth behind that. I guess you're right about that much. Now, how about this? We will go up and talk to Lord Third after we get your elemental affinities tested. We can work out what to do from there. Kakashi frowned thoughtfully. But come to think about it, he'll be stepping down as Hokage soon. Naruto shrugged. Already knew that. Granny Tsunade is gonna be the next Hokage. Damn old woman. I was supposed to be the next Hokage. Kakashi's sweat dropped. Don't let Lady Tsunade hear you say that. As if I care. Jiraiya might be a perv, but at least he doesn't transform himself to make him look like he's 20. True, Kakashi allowed, but I still wouldn't say it to her face. Too late for that. Already told her when we met the first time. Kakashi paled. Okay, I wouldn't advise doing it again though. Lady Tsunade is not one who is known for her patience. He shivered at that thought. She certainly didn't have any patience with him. Before all this rain started, she'd told him that if he intended to continue reading smut on the job, she would roast him alive over a pile of burning Icha Icha. Anyway, let's get that chakra paper. Naruto didn't answer as Kakashi started looking through the stacks of equipment looking for it. He simply stood back to watch his sensei. He didn't know what to think about Kakashi's claim that he tried to adopt him. It wasn't a lie, exactly, but there was just something not right. If Kakashi really cared about him that much, would he have disobeyed Lord Third and done what he wanted? Or was this part of being a real Jonin of the village? Ah, found it. Naruto looked up. That was quick, sensei. Not everything takes a long time, Naruto. Kakashi turned away from the stacks of the equipment with two pieces of paper in hand. He gestured to himself and began speaking. As you said earlier, I use mostly lighting and fire jutsu, but I don't have an affinity for fire. My only affinity is lightning. He held the first piece of chakra paper between his fingers and channeled his chakra. The paper immediately crinkled, and since my affinity is lightning, the paper crumples. If it's fire, it will turn black and burst into flame. If it's water, the paper will become wet. Earth will cause it to harden and turn to dust. And wind will cause the paper to be cut. Naruto took the other piece of paper. So just push my chakra into this and it will tell me my affinity? Pretty much. The Aburame clan harvests this paper from special trees here in Konoha. It reacts very strongly to chakra, unlike most substances. Okay. Naruto held the paper between his thumb and forefinger. Here goes nothing. They both watched as Naruto channeled his chakra. That was when something odd happened. The paper in Naruto's fingers turned a brilliant gold, crinkled, and then fell apart in little yellow flakes. Naruto just looked at the paper flakes fluttered down to the floor dumbly. He opened his fingers and a few more of them fell. He looked up at Kakashi. I'm taking a wild guess that means something different from normal. Kakashi nodded. You could say that. So, what's my affinity? I have no idea. Naruto bent down and picked a few golden flakes up. This wasn't supposed to happen, was it? No, it was not. Kakashi frowned and bent down as well. But, I know someone who will probably know. Let's get a couple of these and go talk to Lord Third. He's not called to professor for nothing. I guess. Naruto and Kakashi entered through the open door to the Hokage's office. The first thing the Jonin saw was a blonde woman wearing what could be the clothes of one Tsunade Senju. His single visible eye rose to the back of her head, catching sight of the twin pigtails going down her back. Yep, that was her all right. Kakashi noted that it looked like her and Lord Third had just finished a heated argument. The old man, who was still recovering from the attempt on his life a few weeks ago, didn't look so good. Tsunade, on the other hand, looked like she was ready to put someone's head through a wall, although that wasn't exactly an uncommon occurrence. Okay, not the best time, but it might actually be a good thing she's here. Tsunade never would have supported Naruto being on his own in the first place. If things get heated, she might back us up. Kakashi? Tsunade turned to see him as Hiruzen spoke. What is it? And why is Naruto with you? Shouldn't you be out helping restore the village? Ahem, yes. Well, some things came up and Naruto wanted to talk to you. We also had something to ask you as pertaining to his elemental affinities. The Hokage sighed and nodded. Very well. But be quick. Naruto glanced up at his sensei as he stepped further into the room. Kakashi looked back down at him, his single eye seeming to say, go for it. He took a deep breath and, after looking at Tsunade for a moment, turned to the old man. I know about my parents' Gigi. All the air seemed to leave the room. Tsunade's eyes widened even as Hiruzen's jaw sagged. Then time sped up. Hiruzen clapped his hands sharply. Anbu. Out. From the corners of the room 4 shadows vanished, leaving them alone. The door was closed without a sound behind them. A second after, Hiruzen clapped his hands again. Fuin. The walls glowed briefly and then went back to normal. Naruto realized belatedly that this was a privacy seal, something that any cage would obviously have installed in his office. His eyes flicked back and forth from Kakashi to Hiruzen, and back. Eventually the Hokage deemed it appropriate to break the silence. How did you find out, Naruto-kun? Naruto frowned. Well, it started with the library being moved to my apartment complex for dry storage. I didn't have anything better to do, so I started reading. But I decided that I wanted a challenge, so I told myself I would read every book in my room before the storm ended. And I did too. But as I was going through, my clones found a couple interesting books that I read personally. One of them was called The Fall. A book about the fall of Uzu, apparently written by my mom. He crossed his arms over his chest, keeping his eyes on Hiruzen. It wasn't long after that when I read an old book written by Pervy Sage. His first book, in which the main character is named Naruto. About the same time, one of my clones read a book about village politics which had a section on Jinchuriki. It all happened so fast that I couldn't help but connect the dots that were there. If my mom was the last Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi and she was also the last officially listed Uzumaki, then I would have to be an Uzumaki too. Since she basically says flat out that only an Uzumaki can hold the Kyuubi. Naruto looked back at Kakashi for a moment, then sighed and turned to Hiruzen. I was wondering who my father was at that point, but I didn't have any leads until a little piece of info from one of my clones popped into my head at just the right time. It's common knowledge to certain groups that Jinchuriki are often made out of relatives of the Kage or village leaders. That way they can keep the Jinchuriki loyal. Of course Kushina Uzumaki had no family here, and neither did Lord Fourth, so I was trying to think of what connected them. Hiruzen let out a small sigh as Naruto pointed out the windows to the Hokage's stone faces. There's actually a couple books written by Lord Fourth among the books I read. And in one of them there's a picture of him from when he was like 17. I realized, after I looked in a mirror, that I almost look like his clone. Naruto's frown deepened. So that's about the time I realized that I'm the son of Kushina Uzumaki and Minato Namikaze. I already asked Kakashi-sensei about it. He explained a bit about why you didn't tell me. But I still want to know your reasons. Tsunade suddenly whistled. Well, old man, looks like the brat wised up. He sounds just like him. Naruto-kun, you need to understand that I am Hokage and as such my responsibility is to the village. You lost your parents the day you were born and the Kyuubi could be sealed inside no other. And unfortunately the seal Minato placed on you is based around your mental well-being. I wanted you to be happy and have a good childhood, but if I did that, then the villagers and no small portion of the shinobi in the village would have rebelled against me. Naruto's fists clenched, but he didn't speak. By the time you were old enough to understand what was happening to you, it was clear that you had inherited your mother's loud mouth and personality. And I couldn't have told you about your parents. The first thing you would have done was climb to the top of Minato's monument and shouted it to the village at large. Can you deny that? No, he grudgingly admitted. So I waited. Kakashi as well as a select few others pestered me incessantly to allow them to adopt you. At the time Kakashi was an Anbu captain with the best record since his own father. I couldn't afford to have him retire and adopt you no matter how much I would have liked it. So I sent you checks and had you moved into your apartment as soon as I could to get you away from the orphanage. It didn't help your case that you decided that being Hokage was your goal, taking your own father as your chief role model even less so. You're saying that because I was such a loud mouth that I couldn't be trusted to keep the secret? Hiruzen shook his head. No, that only cemented an already difficult issue. It states in Minato's will that you will inherit everything from the Namikaze clan. For your information, the only clan that had more wealth in the village was the Uchiha, and Sasuke is no longer here to access that. He sighed and removed his hat, placing it on the table in front of him. The problem is that the civilian council doesn't know about you being his heir. The second I withdraw funds from the Namikaze estate, they will know and want to know why. And I don't have the authority to withdraw the funds from a closed estate without there being a crisis on hand. What about you paying out of pocket with your money like it seems you've been doing? And then when I get access to my estate I can pay you back. If the Namikaze clan was so rich, then there shouldn't be any worries. However, what will others say about that, Naruto? Even after you saved the village from the Shukaku, there are still plenty of short-sighted people in the village who would have you hanged in the street. Listen, Konoha is as close as you can come to a democracy anywhere in the elemental nations. Unfortunately, that is your father's doing. And it worked well for him. But I do not have the same support as he did. The civilians and younger shinobi idolized your father. But today the only ones who feel the same respect for me are old men and women. While I have the last word in all matters, the more I do against the wishes of the village, the less effective any other measures I make will be. Naruto was silent after that, his eyes drilling into the old man with the intensity of a miniature-tailed beast. Okay, so why is that a problem? His voice came out slow. If you can basically do whatever you want at the cost of the village's support, then you can just do whatever you want. And by the time everyone throws you out of office, Granny Tsunade will be right there to take the hat from you. The three older ninjas stared at him for a long moment as Naruto continued. The villagers would be happy because you stepped down. Then she could come in with the wave of enthusiasm at her back. Plus Tsunade is a senju. The Shodem and Nindem were both senju. She's even the Shodai's granddaughter. Hiruzen opened his mouth to reply, and then closed it. He frowned, not liking, and at the same time loving how intuitive Naruto had become in such a short time. A month ago Naruto couldn't have argued his way out of a cardboard box. And today he was convincing a cage to go along with his idea. Maybe the Namikaze blood was finally starting to show through? Plus, Naruto continued, I think it's mainly the civilians who still hate me. Most of the ninja came around after the Chunin exams. There were lots of people who came to visit me in the hospital, my team and friends aside. They wouldn't have even given me a second glance before I took down Gaara. True, Hiruzen shook his head. Regardless, what would you even want me to buy for you, assuming I went with this plan of yours? To start off with, I'd like a halfway decent apartment on a side of town that doesn't have a bar a block away. I'm not saying I'm going to pepper bomb the bar down the street because I already did it and they got the message, but I still get tired of the freaking graffiti on my door. Hiruzen sighed. That I can do. I'd also like some ninja equipment that isn't secondhand and rusting away. Usually I raid the training grounds around the village for kunai, but it's a pain because everyone prefers different sizes and weights. I'm trained to throw standard and no ninja who's above genin level actually uses standard. Kakashi blinked and looked down at him in blatant confusion. But you throw just as good as Sakura, and I know for a fact her kunai and shuriken set is standard. Well yeah, when you're forced to use kunai of varying weights all the time you have to get good at judging the weight instantly. Why do you think Sasuke Teme always got mad at me when we fought ranged battles? His stupid Sharingan couldn't tell the difference between them in mid-flight. One kunai would be lightweight and the next one would be full weight and it would throw off his blocks. Hiruzen scratched his chin thoughtfully. Well, I can certainly get you that. Ninja tools aren't something you should ever have to go cheap on. I bet Kakashi would have bought you a decent set if you'd told him. I would have, you know. Kakashi placed a hand on his head, ruffling his hair. You need to ask about these things. Yeah, but I don't like needing help. Kakashi shrugged. Most ninja don't. Being self-sufficient is a good thing, but knowing when you require assistance is something else entirely. Naruto grimaced and shoved the hand away. I know that. He stepped away from Kakashi. And something else I'd like is a pass from Gigi so I can go in the library without that dumb old woman trying to tell me I'm not allowed. Old hag, someone needs to tell her that she isn't some village big shot just because she knows how to sort books. Hiruzen nodded again, his eyes serious. I can do all of that and more, Naruto, but it occurred to me just now that I'm forgetting something. He grunted as he leaned over, pulling something from his desk drawer. A moment later he came out with a letter. Ah, here it is. Jiraiya-kun wants to take you on a training trip. He'll be showing you fuinjutsu, ninjutsu, taijutsu, and the ins and outs of his spy network. You should know he's your godfather too. A sweat drop formed on the back of Naruto's head. Wah, that old perv is my godfather. Geez, my parents sure set their standards pretty low. But I guess their marriage wasn't common knowledge, so of course they would have a limited number of people to work with. Kakashi and Hiruzen blinked owlishly at that. Tsunade on the other hand. Huh, yeah, I keep liking you more and more, kid. That was a good one. Put that perv in his place. I'm glad you took after your mother in that way. Minato was almost as bad as Kakashi. At least he had the sense not to read Jiraiya's work in public, the moron. My dad was a perv too? Hiruzen nodded sagely. And the luckiest man in the world too. Kushina. Well, she didn't look like much when she was little, but she sure filled out later on. I believe Jiraiya based the main heroine in his third book after her. Of course Tsunade beat him half to death when she found out. Which is why it's called Icha violence. Naruto's face went blank, and then, as if someone was steadily turning up a temperature gauge on the back of his head, his face turned red. His eye twitched profusely and he swallowed loudly once. Pervy sage, based a smut novel, off my mom. Tsunade nodded, her knuckles popping at the mere thought of it. Oh yes he did, and he couldn't even sit down for a week afterwards, much less peep on anyone. Where is he now? Tsunade shrugged and Kakashi scratched his chin thoughtfully. Honestly, I don't know. He's here in the village, somewhere. Hiruzen waved his hand dismissively. He said he'd grab you when he was ready to leave the village again. You'll be gone for 2 years or so. Which means I can get you anything you ask for, but for the most part you won't really get any of it until you get back from the training trip. Naruto didn't dignify that with a reply. Hey brat, what's wrong with you? Tsunade raised one eyebrow. The blonde boy just stood there for a moment, red in the face. Then his lips moved, slowly. I'm gonna kill him. There was a sudden movement off to one side and everyone, save Naruto, looked up. Hey, how's it going? Looks like everyone I wanted to talk to is all in one place. Perfect. Hiruzen chuckled. Jiraiya, we were just talking about you. Yeah, about how I almost beat you to death. Tsunade said, smirking. Jiraiya laughed. Huh? Which time? The one where I found out you based a smut character off. You bastard. I'm going to kill you. Tsunade was interrupted by a shout as Naruto launched himself at Jiraiya. Although surprised by the sudden attack, Jiraiya was not inexperienced enough to let the blonde missile connect. So he casually slipped to the side as Naruto shot out of the window behind him. What he wasn't expecting was Naruto to anticipate this and make a shadow clone to throw him back into the building. Or in this case, into the small of Jiraiya's back. Unsuspecting of the surprise attack turned sneak attack, the Sannin wasn't able to dodge this time. So as he sat on the window sill, Jiraiya received 2 feet in the small of his back at near terminal velocity. The force, which would have knocked a lesser man unconscious, only threw Jiraiya forward. Unfortunately for him, he was thrown directly into the not inconsiderable bust of Tsunade Senju. The events that followed were more than enough to knock any man or woman, or Biju, unconscious. The flurry of blows that assailed Jiraiya reduced him to a pile of tenderized flesh and bruises in 3 seconds flat. From the window sill, Naruto admired his handiwork with smug self-satisfaction. Kakashi and Hiruzen merely prayed for Jiraiya's safe return to the land of the living. Tsunade hadn't been holding back on those last few hits. Even the reinforced floor underneath Jiraiya's prone form was cracked. So, Naruto, was that why you wanted to know where Jiraiya was? Naruto turned to Hiruzen and nodded, smiling devilishly. Pretty much. Tsunade growled. Idiot, probably let you hit him hoping to get off the hook, the nerve of him. She turned and paced to the other side of the room where she dropped down onto the small couch. She crossed her arms, being careful not to accentuate her assets any more than they already were. Her hazel eyes remained trained on the unconscious man with distaste. Eventually Kakashi coughed. Anyway, there was another matter, not related to Naruto finding out about his parents. And what is that? Kakashi motioned for Naruto to come forward, which he did. And he took one of the pieces of chakra paper Kakashi provided. Well, when we attempted to discover his elemental affinity, something quite odd happened. Instead of the paper splitting in half or crinkling like I expected, it turned gold, crinkled and then dissolved into flakes. Hiruzen's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sounds like a bloodline, would you show it to me, Naruto-kun? Naruto walked across the room and stood in front of the desk, followed by Kakashi. Tsunade, curious as to the result, stood and walked over as well. Naruto glanced around at them for a second and then held the piece of chakra paper over the table in front of Hiruzen. Then he pulled on his chakra. The white paper quickly turned a metallic gold, then instantly crinkled. A second later it fell apart like ash in the wind. The gold flakes scattered on the table, making Hiruzen blink in confusion. Tsunade's reaction was much the same. What the hell kind of affinity is that? Hiruzen stoked his chin. The crinkling of the paper shows a strong lightning affinity, and I would surmise that the disintegration afterwards showed a weak earth affinity, but that wouldn't make sense as neither of your parents even used earth that much. As for the transformation of color from white to gold, I've only seen that once before. Kakashi tilted his head to the side in surprise. Where? With Minato. His chakra paper would turn yellow and then shred itself. A very strange reaction. I only know because Jiraiya came to ask me what it meant. Sadly, I still don't know what the color change symbolizes. Could it be some kind of para-elemental affinity then? Tsunade shifted and used a finger to collect a few flakes. Maybe a combination of wind and lightning. Weren't those Minato's main elements? It could be that, but Minato didn't have a bloodline. His lightning element was significantly weaker than his wind affinity. And neither did Kushina, although her affinities were water and fire. Hiruzen leaned back. Naruto, do you feel anything strange when you manipulate your chakra? Naruto shrugged. I don't know. It feels kinda warm inside, and sometimes, like when I'm making the Rasengan. My skin feels tingly, but that's all. Kakashi hummed. The tingly feeling is typical of lightning users. I feel that every time I channel lightning chakra. And the heat? Well, that's indicative of fire chakra circulating. I'm honestly very surprised you don't feel a cooling sensation. That's more for wind users, which Minato most certainly was. Kakashi is right. Then, how about this, Naruto? You try to do that again and I'll place my hand over yours to see if I can distinguish your chakra natures that way. As someone who has mastered 4 of the 5 elemental natures completely, I should be able to achieve that much. Okay. Naruto took another slip of chakra paper from Kakashi and held it while Hiruzen placed his hand on his wrist. Go ahead, Naruto-kun. Naruto closed his eyes and tried to shove as much chakra as he could into the slip of paper. The chakra paper, which was designed to be activated with even the most minuscule amount of chakra. The kind of chakra that a fresh genin would produce, exploded in shower of gold dust. It seemed to drift on the air as it fell to the table, looking like glitter. That just happened? Kakashi's eyes flicked to Naruto. Just how much chakra did you use just now? About enough to make 3 shadow clones. Tsunade face-palmed. Naruto baka, that's more chakra than most chunin possess, and that paper would react to a genin farting as long as they were holding it tightly. She glared at Naruto. How is Hiruzen supposed to read your chakra like that? Actually, I managed to get a decent reading off of that. Hiruzen smiled slightly. Wind and lightning, powerful lightning affinity. And an even greater wind affinity. And he also has a very slight affinity for fire. I believe it was probably crowded out by the wind affinity, being that they are opposite elements. He frowned. But there is something else there, very strong, yet also hard to sense. I have no idea what it is. It's almost as though your chakra has a welcoming feel. Naruto looked puzzled. What do you mean by that? Your chakra doesn't seem warm, exactly. It's as if, but it's hard for me to explain. Think of it like this: when someone normally connects their chakra to another's, it's like 2 walls hitting each other. When I reached out to touch your chakra, it was more like. Hiruzen seemed to search for the right words for a minute. Quote ellipsis. It felt more like shaking hands. Like my chakra was greeting yours? Naruto withdrew his hand and scratched the back of his neck, confused. Well, that's weird. Kakashi turned to Hiruzen. What could that mean? I have no idea, Kakashi. Everyone's chakra feels different. For instance, your chakra is much more smooth than most lighting users, Kakashi. Just as Tsunade's chakra has a rigid feel. However, I've never encountered someone where the feel of their chakra actually affected their chakra network. So is there no method of finding out why his chakra paper turns gold and flakes away the way it does? Tsunade seemed put off by the idea that even the professor didn't know what to make of it. Hiruzen shook his head. If we knew what we were looking for, then yes, but as it stands now, we have no way of knowing the real cause. Perhaps in time he may manifest some manner of unique ability. Until then, we will have to wait and see. Naruto crossed his arms. Fine, but, back to the other topic. What makes you think I want to go off with the perv for who knows how long? They just stared at him for a moment before Kakashi asked, is there a reason why you don't want to go and train with a member of the legendary Sannin for 2 years? What do you mean, legendary? The only legendary thing about him is his smut novels. When I went to train with him last time, the only thing I learned was how to unlock the Kyuubi's chakra. And he did that by throwing me off a cliff. Naruto's eyes blazed with self-righteous fury as he mercilessly kicked the still unconscious Jiraiya. And the Rasengan? I could have mastered that in a day or 2 if he actually stayed around to teach me. Instead, he just handed me a bunch of rubber balls and told me. Rotation, power, and satiability. Then he took my wallet and went off to the freaking whorehouse. Hiruzen, Kakashi, and Tsunade remained silent for a few minutes until a low groan came from somewhere near the floorboards. Tsunade, in a rare moment of self-control, grabbed Jiraiya by the collar and started dragging him out of the room. Allow me to deal with this, Hiruzen. I'll be back in a little while. The door slammed shut a second later. Naruto smiled as, a short while later, he heard the screaming coming from the second floor. He turned his attention back to his sensei, who looked as though he was about to speak. Kakashi took a moment to compose himself. Naruto, did you just say that you mastered the Rasengan in a week, and practically without help? So what? It wasn't hard after I figured out what I was doing wrong. It's not my fault that my chakra control sucks. Otherwise I would have gotten it right away. Did you forget I mastered shadow clones in a single night? I might be dense sometimes, but I was always good at mastering jutsu. Hiruzen's head turned to Kakashi. Do you recall when I told you to focus on Sasuke while you were training Squad 7? Yes. If I ever tell you to do something like that again, and Naruto is involved, feel free to ignore me. Understood, Lord Third. Kakashi grinned under his mask. He was so going to use this in the future. Naruto deadpanned. So what is so great about being trained under pervy sage again? I didn't hear anything that makes it sound like a good idea yet. The Hokage swiveled in his chair. Contrary to what you believe, Naruto, Jiraiya can be an excellent teacher. He merely has trouble getting his priorities straight. I think that he could turn you into Jonin material in 2 years, provided he spends most of that time training you. I'll think of some way for you to make sure he does that. Just remind me of it before you leave. Okay, but what would we do for 2 whole years anyway? For starters, he would take you around to see the elemental nations during a time of peace. And as a member of the Sannin, they are recognized as heroes even in the other villages like Iwa. Their fight against Hanzo of the Salamander is known across the entire continent. Jiraiya has permission to enter any of the hidden villages, on the condition he doesn't stir up trouble. So he is best suited out of anyone in the village to show you how each of the villages work. Kakashi nodded in agreement. Plus Jiraiya is a master of ninjutsu and tactics. He might not use his head much since he can power through almost any challenge without coming up with a plan beforehand, but when it comes down to it, he's as clever as they come. And best of all, he can introduce you to fuinjutsu. I have the feeling that with your family background, you'll take to it like a fish to water. A huff of disappointment left Naruto as he stared at the 2 men. Oh fine then, I'll train with the perv. But if he starts doing the same thing he did the last 2 times, then we'll waste even more time when I prank the living hell out of him. And I encourage you to do that should the situation arise. But for now let me find a solution to keeping Jiraiya-kun in line. Hiruzen smiled eerily. I look forward to the challenge. Perhaps. There was a loud crash followed by an even louder scream that reverberated from the floor below. Perhaps it would be best if you go home and rest for tonight. In the morning we can sort this out and the 2 of you can get underway. I'll have someone deliver the new equipment to your house as well. Really? What about the… Hiruzen waved him off. When Tsunade finishes dealing with Jiraiya he will be in no condition to talk, much less go anywhere. Get home and rest, unless you have something else you want from me. Naruto paused, then nodded. There is something else I wanted, as long as you took the news about me finding out who my parents were well. And that is? See, could I have something from my parents? You know, like something to remember them with? He looked down at the floor, suddenly feeling nervous. It's just that now that I know who they were, it feel like there isn't any connection there, ya know. Hiruzen shot a look at Kakashi. Kakashi, take him to his parents' house? Make sure you aren't seen and what he takes isn't something that will be recognized. Go on now, and come back as soon as Naruto is in his apartment. You got it. Kakashi motioned to Naruto. Come on, let's go. Your parents' house is on the north side of the village, a short way from here. Naruto nodded and followed his sensei out the open window. A long while later Naruto lay on his bed holding a sword. The blade itself was anonymous. Kakashi had told him that he couldn't take the sheath with him as it was too easily recognized for what it was. Kakashi also told him the sword was called Tamashi no Kamasora. Naruto looked up the length of the blade, slightly curved at the tip with the metal itself made of fine chakra-laced steel. However, this sword was different from others. Instead of the polished silver of a normal katana, this blade was Damascus. The folding process usually applied to blades of normal steel didn't apply to this. As Kakashi said, it required massive amounts of heat to make chakra-laced steel malleable. Therefore blades like this could only be forged in conjunction with a skilled fire-type shinobi. And seeing how the vast majority of weaponsmiths capable of forging a work of art like this were numbered among the samurai in the land of iron, blades like this were rare indeed. Kakashi only agreed to let him take his mother's blade under one condition. He had to keep it under wraps at all times, save in desperate combat. And in the event that someone recognized the weapon, he had to make sure that either he or Jiraiya killed that person. He'd reluctantly agreed, but kept it to himself that he wouldn't kill someone just for recognizing the blade. After all, what were the chances that he'd stumble across someone, who just so happened to make him draw his sword, and that person be one of the few who'd seen it before? He didn't think it was all that likely. Besides, he felt drawn to the sword. It was like the weapon called to him. He had to have it, both as a reminder of his heritage, and because he somehow felt oddly empty without it now. Naruto idly brushed his finger over the spiral hilt and up the blade. It was a beautiful weapon. He just hoped Jiraiya could teach him how to use it properly. After he finished admiring the blade, he picked up the memento he'd taken for his father. It wasn't a weapon at all. Instead, it was a small journal. His father's journal. Kakashi let him take it, mainly because he was the only one who could read it. To Kakashi, the pages appeared blank. So the Jonin didn't really see the harm in letting him have a book that only a Namikaze, of which Naruto was the last, could read. Naruto snickered to himself as he opened the journal and started reading. Unknown to Kakashi, this was actually a Fuinjutsu notebook. Naruto guessed that his father didn't much care for people who looked at his notes on space-time manipulation. Why else would Kakashi be unable to read the book while he could clearly see the neat yet quite cramped script? A slight chuckle escaped him. Kakashi was under the impression that this was his dad's diary or something like that. Well, that wasn't what it was in the least. Now granted, he didn't understand most, if not all, of the tightly packed notes, but he was going to be training with a Fuinjutsu master for a few years. He was sure he'd be able to decipher his father's notes of Fuinjutsu by then. If not, it's no big deal. From what I've read, everyone has different styles when it comes to advanced Fuinjutsu. I'll just have to work my way up to that level eventually. Shouldn't be that hard. Mom said in her book that Uzumaki have a natural talent for it. Naruto sighed and closed the book, turning his head to look out the window. The rain had stopped and he was going to be gone sometime during the next day. Gone from the village for the first time in his life. Okay, so he'd left the village plenty of times before, but those were during missions. This would be for 2 whole years. That was a considerable chunk of his lifespan. He was only 14. 2 years was 1/7 of his entire life. And he'd be spending it with Jiraiya of all people. Naruto let out a retching sound and sat up quickly, closing his father's book and putting it to the side. Fuck, what convinced me to let myself go on a 2-year trip with that guy? I mean, he's a complete perv who would probably hand me a book on Fuinjutsu and then go into town for a month to research. Swinging his feet out of bed, Naruto stood up. He quickly paced past his clones who were still reading studiously. A few steps later, he entered the bathroom. Naruto flicked on the light and shoved his face into the mirror, examining his reflection. So many things were rushing around in his head. It was hard to limit the flow to just one thing. It felt like listening to 10 different people talking at the same time and yet being able to pick out each conversation at will. The knowledge that his clones had given him was still flying through, throwing odd irrelevant fact out when he least expected it. His feelings about Kakashi, Gigi, and the upcoming trip didn't help either. Shit, I'm getting a headache again. Naruto muttered, glaring at his reflection as he tried to think about each event of the last few days clearly. Maybe if he could do that, he could put each separate train of thought to rest. Right now his brain felt crowded, overfull. He needed to put everything in order and get back to taking things one at a time. I need to get out of here. Naruto left the bathroom and fled the apartment through his window, which he left open. He made his way to the roof, where the night sky over Konoha was black without a star in sight. Naruto sat down and, after a moment of hesitation, lay down on the cool concrete. His eyes stared up at the night sky as his mind slowly processed the flood of revelations and knowledge that had built up over the last week. It was a bit hard to imagine, even now, that he was the son of the 4th Hokage. A small part of him expected Kakashi and Hiruzen to deny everything when he asked. But no, they hadn't. He was glad that they didn't try to lie to him anymore after he called them out. It wasn't exactly a good feeling, but it wasn't a bad feeling either. So far today had been one of those days that seemed ridiculously long, and yet went by with extraordinary swiftness. He hoped there weren't too many days like this in his future. He didn't like the suspense involved with knowing he was lied to and that he couldn't do anything to get answers from those who had done it. Hiruzen was all right for now. The old man obviously had put the village's concerns above his own, and he couldn't blame him for that. He was disappointed, of course. There was no way he couldn't be. And it left him a little empty inside knowing that his Gigi had deceived him. But in the end he could forgive Hiruzen. Kakashi was the same way. From what he'd been told, Kakashi tried to help him for a long time, even trying to adopt him repeatedly. For that he was grateful, even though it didn't turn out. His sensei was a decent person, if slightly pathetic, and an unrepentant pervert. That wasn't exactly a bad thing though, just awkward. Naruto closed his eyes, shutting out the night sky and its template of stars. A part of him wished that he could unlearn everything he'd found out recently, maybe even revert back to the immature kid he'd been a few short days before. But at the same time the very idea was abhorrent. He wanted to be smart, to see things that weren't blatantly obvious. He felt like he needed to understand the way this world worked. It would be so fulfilling to know he wasn't wasting his time anymore. What a difference a few books could make. Naruto suddenly sat up, an idea forming in his mind and a smile curling the corners of his lips. He had something to ask the Hiruzen about. Hinata Hyuga was an early riser, even more so than most in her clan. And for a family in which the average wake-up time was 6 in the morning, that was early indeed. But what did she do with all that extra time? Well, she certainly didn't train, and today was no different. With a small yawn that anyone in the village would have admitted was beyond cute, Hinata sat up in bed, raising her arms above her head as she stretched. Then she was moving, slipping out of bed and over to her elaborate dresser in which all her clothes were stored. She pulled out her customary jacket, pants, and pulled her headband off the top of the dresser. Then with everything ready she moved to the bathroom. 10 minutes later she left the bathroom fully dressed and ready to go about her day. Hinata opened the door to her room and peeked out. Sure enough, no one was there. Good. Hinata activated her Byakugan, ignoring the room to her left where Hanabi slept. Instead she turned her attention to the room down the hall. Neji's room was farther away, but still within the limits of her vision. Thankfully it seemed that Neji was still asleep. Hinata smiled slightly and slipped out of the room, quietly shutting the door behind her. Then without a sound she moved down the hall and past Neji's room, giving the door a wide berth. A minute later she was out of the Hyuga compound's main building and walking steadily across the grounds. The few Hyuga who were about at this hour were branch clan members, and even then these were only the guards. No one else would be awake at this hour without good reason. The guards paid her no mind as she walked out of the gates and off the Hyuga compound's land. She however took note of who they were. Again she was thankful that these were men who wouldn't report her presence to her father or the elders. Hinata pushed chakra into her muscles and then jumped, leaping up over the wooden barricade that had kept the water at bay for the last few weeks. She glanced back, making sure one last time that her escape from the day's duties was complete. She was home free. Hinata smiled and skipped across the roof, intent on finding one person. It had been far too long since she'd seen him. Naruto Uzumaki was her target, and she was uniquely suited to finding him. Closing her eyes, Hinata allowed her mind to calm. Then she opened them, activating her Byakugan. Her head turned slowly as her focus shifted, allowing her to see in greater detail. Once her path had been chosen, Hinata blasted off eastward. 5 minutes later she touched down on the building across the street from Ichiraku's. Sure enough she could see the orange pants sticking out from below the curtain. Her cheeks reddened slightly as she knelt down out of sight and continued to observe the blonde boy, wishing she was down there with him. After a few seconds passed she was able to pick his voice out, along with that of his Jonin-sensei. She settled down to listen. Naruto, your idea is ingenious? Kakashi smiled beneath his mask. In fact I'd be scared that you might use that on me at some point. But it would definitely work to keep Jiraiya focused on your training. I know, right? Can't have him going off and leaving me on my own now, can I? But you know the problem with that, right? What? Kakashi's eyes smiled and held up a finger. There's only one person in the village capable of making a seal like that, and that person is Jiraiya himself. I doubt that he would willingly put that kind of seal on himself merely for your benefit. Oh, that? I already came up with something to get around that. How? Well, you know how big a perv he gets around Granny Tsunade, right? Of course. Naruto grinned. What do you think pervy Sage would do to get a free feel on her tits? Kakashi paused. I'm not sure that's a valid question. The silver-haired Jonin seemed to consider it for a moment. Anything short of dying or having his balls cut off, I think he'd be fairly comfortable with. Exactly. Naruto gestured to himself. Just like I'd do anything for a lifetime supply of ramen, he'll do anything to cop a feel. But the biggest weakness he has is Granny Tsunade. So I figured that if I could get Tsunade to let him grope her, that he'd probably be so happy he'd agree to almost anything. But Naruto, Lady Tsunade would never do that, ever. Naruto's low chuckle sounded almost evil. Oh, hee, I already got her to agree to it this morning. But she wasn't happy about me waking her up, sure. But after I told her she was getting 3 months of free sake, however much she wanted on demand and of the highest quality. Well, let's just say she came along to my way of thinking. Kakashi looked like he was about to burst from curiosity. Again, I ask how? It was easy. First I went over to Jiraiya's apartment and stole his wallet, which let me tell you, it was loaded. Then I ran over to the place on the south side of the village that sells sake. Turns out that with the huge storm, the guy was having to sell off huge portions of his stock to pay for damages to his shop. I used Jiraiya's money to pay for a few big cases of sake, which I took with me when I went to see Tsunade this morning. Naruto winked roguishly at Kakashi. I managed to convince her that Jiraiya had bought them for her as an apology, but that he also wanted a real chance at fondling her breasts, but wasn't brave enough to come himself. I stayed with her until she was completely wasted and after an hour got her to agree. Why? You mean she actually agreed to let Lord Jiraiya grope her deliberately? Yeah, you should have seen her. She was out of it. Almost drank every bottle I brought her. I was wondering where she put it all. I'm bad enough with ramen, but she was completely ridiculous. Anyway, I got her to agree to let Jiraiya mess with her breasts, and that's when I came over here. I wanted to know if you had anything to add to the seal. Besides the part of the seal that cuts off blood flow to his nether regions? Yep, or the part that alters his taste buds, making alcohol taste disgusting to him? That too. Well, I would advise you get Lord Third to add a boundary seal over that so that Jiraiya doesn't simply remove it from himself at a later date. Naruto considered this for a second, then nodded. Yeah, I can see how that would help. Thanks for mentioning it. I'll tell Gigi to do that. He chuckled. I can't wait to see Jiraiya's face after the first month when he realizes that he won't be able to do research instead of training me, hehe. Kakashi deadpanned. The Jonin turned away from Naruto and to the smiling form of Ayame Ichiraku, who was wiping down the bar. So, Ayame-san, what's your opinion on Naruto leaving for so long? The girl looked up from her task, her eyes a bit sad, but a smile lingering about her lips. I think it's great. He'll be able to get out and see the outside world like he used to talk about. Plus, from what I hear, he'll be getting trained by one of the Sannin. Not something that every blonde baka gets a chance at. Hey, I'm not stupid. Sure Naruto-kun. Just remember not to let that old pervert taint you. I'd hate to have to chase you around with my ladle when you get back. She smiled and raised the improvised weapon in a semi-threatening manner. You should know I didn't become a cook under father. I was trained by someone else entirely. Kakashi and Naruto were both looking at the pretty brunette with twin looks of horror. Neither of them could overcome the feeling of absolute dread that overcame them in that very moment. Naruto swallowed hard and glanced at his sensei. Kakashi in turn glanced at him. Ayame-ne-chan is scary. Indeed. The girl pouted adorably as she shouted, I'm not. Naruto pointed an accusing finger at her. R2, I bet that's how you got the street around Ichiraku's fixed so fast. You probably scared all the ninja into doing the part in front of this place first. Ayame's next words were interrupted by a shout from the back. Well, looks like the kid's not nearly as dense as we thought. Oh, shut up, Dad. Naruto chuckled while Kakashi scratched the back of his head nervously. Anyway, Ayame, Naruto, I have some duties to attend to. But I would advise you going to see Hokage-sama soon. You don't have long before you leave. And 3 years is a long time. The blonde nodded. I know, see you later I guess. He grinned suddenly and demolished his bowl of ramen with speed that equaled and surpassed his father's. Then he was gone like an arrow from a bow. Kakashi sighed and stood, having no food to finish. He then turned, only to be stopped by a sweet voice. Oh dear Kakashi-san, are we forgetting something? The copy ninja felt a chill run up his spine as he turned to gaze backwards with his one visible eye. What he saw, he would vow never to speak of in his life, other than to his kids. And that was only 50-50. Ayame's eyes had turned from brown to a violent purple and they were squinted nearly shut. A dark violet aura dripped from her skin as she held aloft the ladle as though it were a ceremonial sword, and a snarling demon mask was materializing out of thin air behind her. With speed that matching the Hiraishin, Kakashi's wallet, along with every bill in it, was dropped on the counter while the Jonin fled the scene. A few seconds later the aura dropped and Ayame wilted like a dying flower. Taking out a handkerchief from her pocket she wiped her now sweating face as she thought, damn, that takes a lot out of me. I wonder what kind of monster sensei must have been to use that all the time. Or, maybe it's just because I have low genin chakra reserves, oh well. The look on Kakashi's face was so worth it. Ayame smiled and stepped out from the front and into the back of the shop to yell at her father. But the elderly man was unconscious, pale, and sweating in the corner. His lips twitched in his nightmarish slumber. Nalahime, protect me. Our daughter has become such a terrifying young woman. Ayame sighed and shook her head. The technique didn't do any physical harm. Why were people so afraid of it? Oh well, she got paid. And there was a generous tip too. With a smile she got around to waking her old man. Hiruzen Sarutobi woke with a start. His aged eyes opened quickly as he looked around his office. His lips twitched into a smirk. How long had it been since he'd stayed overnight in his office? Well, truth be told, it had been a long time. He missed the feeling of being a studious and active shinobi. Of course he was still acting Hokage, but that wasn't what he meant. He missed the adrenaline that came with protecting Konohagakure and its people, staying up late every night, devising plans and holding council meetings. The last time he remembered truly having this feeling was when Minato had been soon to be elected as 4th Hokage. Back in those days everything seemed perfect. The war was pretty much over at that point, the village was intact, and with the Yellow Flash as then next Hokage it seemed like the Hidden Leaf was untouchable. Was it Naruto's discovery that prompted this sudden inpouring of inspiration? After all, he'd been walking on proverbial eggshells, praying that Naruto didn't wise up too soon and alert the village to his true identity. Thankfully the boy seemed to have matured to an astounding degree in a very short time. Maybe he always had the potential to do so and it was just hidden up till now. Regardless of where his energy had come from, Hiruzen was determined to make the most of it. He sat up and scanned his desk, and in particular the seal that was laid out in front of him. His mind flashed back to the events of the previous day. He knew that Naruto was right. Jiraiya was a complete and utter pervert, with few if any distinguishing personality traits besides stubbornness to offset that. If Naruto was to go off for 2 years, or more, you never really knew, then he would need to be trained by Jiraiya to survive out there. And therein lay the problem. Jiraiya, for all his power and skill, was a king in the world of procrastination. Perhaps surpassing even himself in that regard. He would put things off, constantly, and what was more, he usually came back blind drunk. And he didn't even have the dubious honor of having Tsunade's godlike resistance to alcohol. If Naruto went with him at this time, there would be nothing more than a repeat of his first trip with the Toad Sage. In other words, he would be gone for years and probably come back with at most 3 new jutsu and a hell of a lot bigger chakra reserves. At least that's what would happen if Naruto did nothing to further his own learning, which a month ago he would have been incapable of doing. Either way, the boy needed a way to make Jiraiya do his job for once. Hiruzen rubbed his eyes as he smoothed over the seal diagram on his desk. This would fit the bill nicely. With the knowledge of how the Hyuga used their caged bird seals, and about 8 hours of tampering, he'd succeeded in watering down the seal enough that it only responded to at most 10 commands. Of course, he'd already removed anything from the seal that would be physically detrimental to Jiraiya. Although that wasn't really an issue. This seal, once applied, would allow Naruto to basically force Jiraiya to get his ass in gear. Its primary function would allow Naruto to find Jiraiya anywhere, and vice versa. After that, the seal would do 3 things on command from Naruto. First, it would make Jiraiya's hands shake like an addict going through withdrawal, which would make it awfully hard for him to take notes when given research material. The second command would dull all feeling in his nether region, eventually causing him to go completely numb. And the last would disrupt Jiraiya's chakra as if a genjutsu were being dispelled. These were aimed at 3 areas in specific. First was to prevent Jiraiya from getting distracted in the first place. If he wasn't getting horny, he'd be much less inclined to drop Naruto off somewhere and peep. The second was designed to prevent him from writing or taking notes when he did have the opportunity to peek, and third would allow Naruto to dispel that troublesome light deflection technique that Jiraiya could use. Hiruzen smiled as a thought sprang into his mind. Yes, that might just work. A knocking at his door caused him to look up. "Come in." The door opened and Naruto peeked in, a devilish grin plastered on his face. "Is now a good time?" Hiruzen smiled right back. "Never better, actually. Come on in." Tsunade Senju peeled her drool-covered face off the arm of her couch and sat up. She had been awake for nearly an hour already, trying to piece together what remained of her self-respect. It wasn't easy. In fact, she didn't know if she could ever do it. Why? Because she'd allowed that smirking little blonde fox that called himself a child to talk her into letting Jiraiya, of all the perverts in the world, to touch her breasts. Sure, she was completely wasted at the time, so a reasonable person could probably get out of this easy, but such is not the case with her. She was notorious for her ability to drink a line of people under the table, one after the other in some cases. In fact, in Demon Country she had become a local legend for challenging an entire guard's barracks to a drinking contest. Which she won, by the way. But, so was the problem. She had known what she was agreeing to at the time, no matter how blind drunk she'd been. The fact that she even remembered doing it at all was proof enough that she knew what she was agreeing to. Oh, how she hated herself. She could admit to herself that she liked Jiraiya. In fact, in some of her more reasonable moments she could probably admit to caring for him even more than that. But it was her pride that refused to let anyone else know that. And now she was letting that perv grope her on a promise from a teenager. Oh Cammy, what was the world coming to? Obviously she was going to keep her promise. She was honor-bound to do so regardless of how Naruto obviously got her drunk beforehand. Damn, kid was getting too smart too quickly. From what she remembered of the kid who had convinced her to come back to the village, it almost seemed like his mind was making up for lost time, making him smarter by the day. Tsunade blinked owlishly as she saw Shizune, out cold with her face on the living room table. A half-empty bottle of sake by her head. The soon-to-be fifth Hokage felt her eyebrows twitch as she leaned forward to grab the bottle. She popped the lid and took a long swig. PHF'd. Lightweight. Hinata nodded to herself as she watched her father's head fall forward into his breakfast with a small thump. Off to one side, Hanabi, her precious and far too serious little sister, was already mumbling in her sleep. Neji, well, he didn't want to come down for breakfast, so she ambushed him and tied him up. He was still unconscious in his room. As for the rest of her clan, the elders would be in no position to follow, and the side branch had already been dealt with. Herbs borrowed from the hospital to put them to sleep at breakfast. The eldest daughter of Hiyashi Hyuga felt her face tighten with determination. Once more she felt her chest burn with commitment as she reaffirmed her resolve. The Hyuga clan was out of commission for at least a few hours. Her bags were packed, and there was only one thing left to do. I'm not letting you leave without me, Naruto-kun.